Minister Coffey, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 2014 Construction Industry Federation Annual Conference. We have a fantastic programme of speakers lined up for you during the course of the morning. And CIF, we always pride ourselves on securing speakers that will offer content that will help our members and guests to learn more about the industry and will allow them to take some extra wisdom and insight away with them. Looking at the lineup of speakers we've prepared for you today, I think this year's conference will more than live up to that goal. One of the most noticeable things about this year's conference has been the exceptional level of interest. We're expecting more than 250 people in the Aviva today, and that's a significant increase in last year's event. I suppose there are many factors behind this increase, including top-class lineup of speakers, but perhaps the most obvious has been the turnaround in the performance of the industry over the last 12 months. This time last year, the industry had only just turned the corner. Maybe we were only just starting to turn the corner. There were signs of improvement, but really the industry was only taking the tentative steps to get back on its feet. The work was beginning to come into the pipeline, but was still only a trickle, not a generous flow. The trickle has been steadily flowing, however, and the industry is in a far better state than it was in October 2013. The number of people working in the sector has risen. If you look at the latest CSO stats, there was a jump in construction employment between the first and second quarter of this year of 4,000. 4,000 more people back in work over a 3-month period. That's a very positive statistic, and it's one we believe the industry is more than capable of exceeding in the coming months. I suppose the pickup has been primarily focused on Dublin, the counties around Dublin, and other urban areas such as Cork and Galway. But activity increases, that growth should start to reach every region and every sector. It won't happen overnight, but if the number of projects continue to grow, then it will lead to more construction work and more construction jobs being created throughout the country. Of course, this pickup has been long awaited. Now that it has arrived, the aim has to be maintaining that growth. One of the key steps to achieving that goal is the focus from government on our sector. Thankfully, after much pressing by CIF, the definitive expression by government of their support for the construction sector arrived last May in the form of Construction 2020. To say Construction 2020 is a watershed for the industry is an understatement. The 75 actions contained in the strategy have the capacity to revolutionise the construction sector and to place it in a much healthier position. It can do so much for the industry and the wider economy. The introduction to Construction 2020 outlines the significance of having a growing sector. It says, and I quote, "Ireland needs a competitive, innovative, dynamic, safe and sustainable construction sector. One that makes its full and proper contribution to the economy and to job creation, and one that is based on best practice and capable of delivering the economic and social infrastructure we need to build and sustain a prosperous future." We could have written that. Who can argue with that? The industry has been pressing for just this type of recognition from the government and the wider economy ever since the crash. Now that we have the blueprint, the time has come to start building on it. Construction 2020 will mean nothing, though, unless flesh is put on the bones of these proposals. It will not start to have a real, practical impact until we see these policies developed in a meaningful way, a way that will allow the industry to move forward and start delivering work and more jobs. This is a vitally important time for our industry. The next steps in how Construction 2020 is handled will have a lasting impact on our sector for many years to come. It's so important that we even took it as the title for this year's conference. Achieving Construction 2020's vision isn't just an outline of these next steps, but a challenge to the industry and all the stakeholders involved. Are we going to create competitive, innovative, dynamic and sustainable construction sector proposed in 2020? Will the measures allow us to create the targeted 60,000 extra jobs in the coming years? Will we get our sector to a level where it is responsible for 12% of the country's GNP? These are all targets set within Construction 2020. But now we have the targets, we have to start moving towards them. Construction-based policy is a very effective mechanism for boosting the Irish economy and for creating jobs. Look at the home renovation incentive, for example. This has been nothing short of a complete and total success. As you know, it allows homeowners to reclaim the VAT on home-based construction projects based between €5,000 and €30,000. The industry had been pressing for this measure to be introduced for some time. We argued it would help cut down the level of black economy activity and would lead to more legitimate businesses securing work. We also said it would act as an incentive for homeowners considering making improvements. The results have been phenomenal. From its introduction at the end of October until late August, a total of 9,336 building projects have been completed under the scheme, and it has already generated a spend of €155 million. These are amazing figures and should be applauded. They also prove that when government works with industry to incentivise construction activity, it pays off for everyone. It has not only led to more work for the industry, but it has also ensured that the work is going to companies who are compliant, creating jobs, and it creates more income tax revenue for government. While the home renovation scheme may have been a relatively modest measure, the success has been keenly felt throughout the industry and wider economy. So imagine how much of an impact fixing other problems in the system would have. One of the key areas in need of significant reform is procurement. The government is completing a review of the public works contracts. The completion of that review is eagerly awaited. No one involved likes the way the current public works contracts operate. They're simply not working. Contractors, surveyors, engineers, architects, the state and the legal profession all believe the current contracts need to be reformed. If the right changes are made during this process, and we get a contract that provides clarity and consistency, it will make a fundamental difference as to how public construction projects operate. Of course, one of the most important players in the development of procurement policy in this country is one of our speakers here this morning, Mr. Paul Quinn, the state's Chief Procurement Officer and CEO of the Office of Government Procurement. Already, Paul has been implementing substantial but necessary changes across the procurement process. He and his office are looking to implement a much more consistent approach. This is warmly welcomed by our industry. One of the key issues we have is the inconsistencies that are involved in the process. This would be resolved by having dedicated procurement specialists providing a more unified approach to the way public procurement operates. These professional procurers are the future and will have a major impact on the sector. However, this change can only happen if Paul receives the backing he requires from government and is given resources he needs to make this happen. Another procurement challenge will be the implementation of the new EU procurement directives. When the previous directives were implemented in 2006, the company made costly mistakes. We acted like these were ironclad pieces of legislation with little flexibility. It resulted in directives being implemented in the country which were rigid and not as fit for purpose compared to those implemented in other EU states. There is a bit of flexibility in the EU directives when it comes to making them fit the needs of the local marketplace. Our hope is that government will take that into account as they implement these latest batch of directives. When we're looking at issues around procurement and contracts, unfortunately, we still have to mention the Construction Contracts Act. That legislation was signed into law by President Higgins in July 2013. Almost 15 months after its enactment, we are still waiting for it to take effect. The CIF recently held a very positive meeting with Minister Simon Harris on the issue, and he seems very keen to get it across the line. The indications are now that it will be spring 2015 before the legislation actually starts being implemented. This was originally introduced into your Oireachtas on the 12th of May 2010 by Senator Quinn. Now, 1,605 days later, we're still awaiting for the protections offered by this legislation. The uncertainty is making things even more difficult. The government can solve this by naming a date. We'd urge them to provide a set date for when this legislation will take effect and stick to it. Another piece of legislation that will have strong impact in our industry will be that which puts our new construction register on a statutory basis. The Construction Industry Register Ireland, or CIRI, was launched by CIF earlier this year following extensive discussions with government. There's a commitment to put CIRI on a statutory footing next year, and we expect to see the bills published before the end of this year. The aim of CIRI is simple. It provides a resource to those who want to engage competent, experienced construction companies, sole traders and builders. All types of construction companies are listed: main contractors, house builders, specialists and subcontractors. To be listed on CIRI, all applicants must show they have competence and practical experience of no less than 3 years. They must be tax compliant, they must adhere to an industry code of ethics, and they have to comply with health and safety regulations. They must ensure the appropriate insurances are in place, and they must undertake continuous professional development, and they must obey all the latest building standards and regulations. What's more, all those listed on CIRI are required to reapply on an annual basis. So to continue on the register, they must continue to meet these criteria. Already, CIRI has seen a strong interest throughout the industry. As of this morning, there are 317 construction companies listed on the register, while a further 782 are at various stages of the application process. That's a total of 1,099 construction companies have already expressed an interest in joining the CIRI register, and by the end of the next year, we expect to see over 2,000 companies listed. I know that many of the people in this room have already joined CIRI, and I encourage anyone who is yet to do so to begin the application process as soon as possible. And before moving away from the topic of legislation, there's another issue that continues to have an impact on our industry. That's the absence of a registered employment agreement. As you were aware, last year, the Supreme Court found the mechanisms by which REAs had been implemented were unconstitutional. That effectively ended the existing REA. Prior to the Supreme Court judgment, contractors could tender for work on a level playing field with regard to labour costs. This level playing field has now been removed, which has left contractors in a very, very difficult situation. Our members are finding it increasingly difficult to tender for work and compete against contractors who are taking advantage of the removal of legally binding rates of pay. Our industry is emerging from recession, and we must ensure that Irish contractors are in a position to benefit from the upturn. The legislation is urgently required to ensure that Irish contractors can tender and win future work. The government has said they will bring forward legislation that will allow for new REAs to be created. This process now needs to be expedited. The lack of an REA is a real and definitive threat to the future development of the construction industry, and we need to have more clarity brought to these issues before it leads to chaos. Failure could lead the sector prioritising short-term contracts for all future employment, and that is not something that is in the interest of the state, the workers or the industry. We also want to encourage bright young people into the industry to ensure that we maintain standards and have the required skills for the future. We can only do this by paying our workers reasonable and sustainable rates of pay. And when we're talking about the future of the industry, it's also important that we look at the creation of apprenticeships. As you may have read in recent months, there's been a very worrying figures for the number of people taking up apprenticeships in some areas of construction. For example, up to the end of July this year, only 4 plastering apprentices started their training. In bricklaying, only 3 people started, and only 3 began their painting and decorating apprenticeships, while the grand total of people starting tiling apprenticeships was 0. Now, it's true to say that in other sectors of construction have seen a more positive numbers. For example, 385 people have started their electrical apprenticeships in this year, and another 168 started the path to becoming skillful plumbers. However, we need to have these kind of results across the board. If we are serious about creating more construction activity and construction jobs, then we need the skilled employees available to take up these positions. The last thing we as an industry or as a country needs is activity held up by a lack of skilled workers. Now, we know there's a lot of unemployed former construction workers in the country, and this provides a pool of talent for any new jobs that become available, but that pool won't last forever. We need more young, skilled people if we want to keep the sector growing and progressing. Measures need to be introduced that will boost construction apprentice numbers. One step towards that goal was the recent appointment by Minister Jan O'Sullivan of my colleague Tommy Maloney to the Apprenticeship Council. This will provide a construction perspective on the development of apprenticeship programmes. However, future action will be needed. We believe that the system has to be altered so that apprenticeships can be more incentivised. This will lead to more positions opening up, more opportunities for young people, and a greater skills base throughout the industry. The state already provides funding for the first 4 years for training architects and engineers, but this is not the case for construction trades. We think this should change. How is the industry going to be able to build the required number of houses, for example, if we don't have more bricklaying apprentices? It seems like there is now universal acknowledgement that the level of house building in the country has to increase, and we're clearly not generating sufficient supply to meet the country's needs. The ESRI and the government have said we need to build 25,000 units per year. The Housing Agency said we need to build 16,000 per year in urban areas. A study by the Society of Chartered Surveyors found that Dublin alone will require 35,000 units between 2014 and 2018. What everybody agrees is we are currently not building enough homes. Only 8,300 units were built in this country in 2013. That's the lowest level on record. In fact, it's the third successive year we have seen a new low benchmark for house building. Until a few years ago, the lowest number of units built in a single year was 1970, when the total build was about 13,900 houses. House prices are rising fast in Dublin, and a similar trend is beginning in other parts of the country, particularly urban areas. Rent is also on the increase. A recent report by Daft showed that rent rose in every county bar Donegal over the course of the last year. Nationally, rent has risen by over 10% during that 12-month period, and in Dublin, rents have grown by about 17%. But I suppose the most telling statistic of all from the report that there are almost 40% fewer properties available to rent compared to a year ago. Demand for social housing is also on the rise, in Dublin and in other parts of the country. More and more people are finding it difficult to secure accommodation. That's terrible. As a country, we should not be allowing levels of housing to diminish to these levels. Of course, the solution to all these problems is to create more supply, and that will only happen if we allow builders to start in the areas where housing is needed. Even this year, we are likely to see under 10,000 units built nationally and less than 2,000 units built in Dublin. This is completely inadequate. The reality is that builders want to build. So what's holding things up? Well, one of the main blockages is finance. Unlike during the boom times, construction companies do not have large access to cash reserves. They don't have the capital they need to get projects going, and access to finance is still limited. To be fair, the two main banks have been starting to provide development loans again for viable construction projects, and this is a welcome development, as for several years it seemed like the banks didn't want to know about construction at all. However, even now, the loans we provided are not going far enough. Generally, the maximum development finance available is in the region of 60%, and builders are still required to find the balance, and the cost of securing this equity or secondary finance is prohibitive. While banks should be lauded for being more prudent with their finances in the days when practically any construction project was receiving 100% funding regardless of its viability, the current system is going to stop sustainable projects from getting the green light. We simply need a better funding model. This is an action that is included in Construction 2020, and it will be intriguing to see what model develops out of the high-level working group that has been established to find it. We're very pleased to have Mr. Michael Torpey, CEO of Bank of Ireland Corporate and Treasury, with us this morning, and it will be fascinating to hear his contribution on financing construction. Another blockage to house building are the current planning requirements. At the moment, there is planning permission in Dublin for over 26,500 units. However, a large number of those planning permissions relate to apartments in non-central areas of Dublin. The current demand in the market is mostly for own-door unit houses. If a builder has a permission for apartment complex and wants to change that permission to housing, they have to reapply for permission and to begin the whole process again. That can take a substantial period of time, and of course, there's no guarantee of success. Input costs for building is another substantial barrier to increased housing construction. One of the key elements of the cost of the level of development levies. They do not reflect the market realities and they need to be reduced. Levies are not just a problem for house building, but across the entire sector, offices and others. Local authorities used these levels as a funding cash cows in the past. That was an unhealthy practice and can't be allowed to continue. Part 5 requirement needs to be completely re-evaluated. Part 5 requires up to 1/5 of development land for a housing project to be set aside for social housing or its equivalent value to be paid to the local authority. It's a boom time tax, it's never worked, and we need to completely change the way funding for social housing is generated. Those who ultimately pay the price for Part 5 are the new home buyers. It's a tax on those who wish to buy newly built properties. Providing social housing is an onus for all of society and is not fair or equitable that should only be paid by those who opt for a newly built house. A much fairer system would be to introduce a 1% levy for all residential property purchases, which would then be ring-fenced for social housing. If that was introduced last year, a levy of this nature would have created a fund of €60 million for social housing, and that's a year when very few houses were sold, and that's substantially more than the funding created by Part 5. And we estimated with the figures that we have for us now that it would generate another 75 million this year. There's a perception that the construction industry wants to do away with social housing funding. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our proposal is more progressive, more equitable, is easily audited, and will create a more reliable and sustainable source of funding for social housing. Let's put the right system in place. We don't want to see house building projects delayed because of Part 5 or some variation of it adding extra cost. We don't want to see people who want to buy newly built homes unfairly taxed. Social housing is a requirement that affects all of Irish society. It's an ongoing problem that will require an ongoing solution. We can't simply allow the provision of social housing to rest at the various levels of housing being built. That's a system we've already seen does not work. It's a system that we're foolish to rely on in the future. Another of means of lowering the cost of construction and house prices would be to cut the VAT rate. VAT cuts have been very effective in promoting activity in other sectors such as the tourism industry. A temporary VAT cut up to 9% would be a major incentive for house builders. Of course, houses require utilities such as water. It will be very interesting to see how Irish Water interacts with residential construction and the rest of the industry. This is an area which is still being discussed and it needs to be managed sensibly. There's an ongoing requirement for major investment in water services to sustain an economy with a growing population. Irish Water has been receiving a lot of negative publicity in recent times, but from the construction industry's perspective, we have to point out that it has been a source of much needed construction activity at a time when it was badly needed. Of course, if we are to have proper water and water treatment system in this country, we need to get the capital spending going again. Ever since the downturn began, capital spending has been falling and falling. The first budget of the bust, 2009, saw 8.23 billion provided the Exchequer capital spending. By 2014, the budget has fallen to 3.34 billion. That's a drop of 59%. Considering capital spending used to provide half of the industry's activity, it is clear that capital spending will have to rise again if we're to get a sustainable industry. If you look at the water treatment facilities, the schools, the hospitals, the health facilities, as well as the other major pieces of infrastructure that are required in the state, then more funding has to be provided for these projects. The government has boosted capital spending in recent years through the stimulus fund, and more funding of this nature will be required in the future. As well as cuts in spending, another problem in the industry has had to grapple with in recent years has been the problem of pyrite. We've seen too many construction projects damaged by building materials that have contained pyrite. That's not acceptable. It leads to damage to people's houses and their properties. Too many people have seen their homes ruined by pyrite. It has also resulted in construction projects being completed, demolished, and building work having to start again from scratch. No one in the construction industry wants to see pyrite in the projects they've completed. However, the fact is the construction industry is at the mercy of the suppliers that they are provided with. We want to use high-quality, compliant products that are pyrite-free, but we don't have the capacity to test our materials on site. The responsibility for delivering pyrite-free products has to rest with the suppliers. During the summer, CIF issued a note to all members asking them to ensure they receive the correct documentation from their suppliers when taking delivery of building materials. This documentation should show that the products are compliant and generally fit for use on construction sites. We also called on all quarries and material suppliers to ensure their products are compliant with the correct standards and free from pyrite. However, there continues to be a huge threat posed by pyrite, and the danger posed to construction projects by pyritic materials is real. We need better safeguards in the supply chain to prevent these materials from getting onto our sites. The construction industry has to reduce the risk of pyrite. This is an extremely situation and needs to be urgently addressed, so we've taken further action. We've written to all the suppliers of building materials in this country to find out what regulations they are following to ensure their supplies are certified. Our next steps will be to publish the results of that survey in the coming month. So if any supplier has not provided details, we'll state that in our report. We can't allow defective materials to make their way onto our sites. Before I finish up, I'd like to talk to you about the next speaker and what his appointment means to our industry. Earlier this year, Paudie Coffey was appointed Minister for State at the Department of the Environment and given responsibility for housing, planning and the coordination of the Construction 2020 strategy. That's a very long title and a very significant title, and perhaps it hasn't received the focus it deserves. For several years, CIF have been calling for a dedicated minister focusing on the construction sector. We've made the case that there's so much involved in construction policy, and the absence of a coordinating figure responsible for the sector means these issues can often fall between many stools. It would seem that government has listened. In Minister Coffey, we finally have the point of contact we're looking for. The industry has at last been provided with a minister specifically focused on this industry. The minister's full title may be Minister of State with responsibility for housing, planning and the coordination of Construction 2020 strategy. However, within the industry, we have a much simpler title for him, Minister for Construction. Our industry is looking forward to working hand in hand with Minister Coffey over the coming years to develop and grow Irish construction. We know that with the help of government and their ongoing support, the construction industry can be one of the main drivers to economic growth in the years ahead. For several years, we've been pointing out all the industry is capable of. We've discussed the tax revenues that can be generated, the jobs that can be created, and the economic impact the industry can have. With things beginning to rise, now is the time to give the industry the support it needs, and then we, the whole economy, will feel the benefits. This is a very positive time for our industry, and I think the course of today's conference, I hope you'll all hear more reasons to be confident about the future. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you very much for your attention.